Great. Well, Bart, this is us coming together again after a year and about 3 months. We met in Calgary back in 2019, February. During that time, when you were here in Alberta, you gave us a very thorough overview of the Asian Development Bank's program, along with some sage advice for Canadian firms interested in doing business with the bank. Putting COVID-19 aside for a minute, we will get to it. Are there any features or updates that you'd like to highlight about the Asian Development Bank and the opportunities for Canadians that have come up since February of 2019?
Phil, great to connect once again, and greetings from Montreal. It's nice to be communicating with your membership, very distinguished membership all across the country. So the Asian Development Bank continues to play a key role in supporting development in some 40 countries, from Pacific Islands across the Asia landmass, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South and Central Asia, all the way to the Caucasus. So that remains the case. I would say that some of the things that have changed in the last year and a half before we start talking about COVID-19 is that we are beginning to really implement our new long-term strategy. So we adopted a strategy with the support of the Government of Canada, one of our key shareholders, putting a lot more emphasis on cooperation with the private sector, beefing up our non-sovereign operations, looking for co-financing with other partners in our projects, doing more work in climate change adaptation and mitigation, and steering our transport portfolio away from where it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, heavily focused on say, highways and roads. And that's certainly still part of it in countries that don't have good connections, but increasingly looking at urban transport. Given that Asia, like much of the world, is becoming more urbanized, we're doing a lot more with bus rapid transit and subways and the like. I'm just highlighting some of the minor changes as well. They're going to become more major as we shift into the full implementation of this new strategy. So an emphasis on climate, on the environment, on livable cities, sustainability. These are some of the areas where I see opportunities emerging. Canadian firms and consultants with expertise in say, clean tech, in natural resources. There are emerging opportunities, for example, with a new initiative focused on healthy oceans. And so the coastal centers of excellence and where you have experts who have done work with development agencies, they may have opportunities in this space. Let me just stop there for the moment, Phil, but just to give you a flavor, under our strategy 2030, we're moving into some of these areas a bit more than we've been involved in the past.
Great. And toward the end of this interview, Bart, let's chat a little bit about the specifics of how to get in touch with you and how to keep up with what's going on. But let's talk about COVID-19. It's upon us. We're in the midst of it here. This is being recorded in late April 2020. I'm wondering what the bank's current reading of the pandemic's impact on Asia is, and in particular, what your reading is of its impact on the programming of the bank.
Thanks, Phil. And like in Canada, COVID-19 is having an impact on developing Asia and the Pacific. We have heard at this point in late April of 2020 that some countries have made good progress. China seems to have come a long way. In fact, ADB's office opened the day prior to the recording of this interview. Korea has been hailed as a model in how to contain the spread of the pandemic. But poorer countries, the ones that we're working with, many of them are just beginning to face the real challenge of this. Testing is not widespread. Health facilities have low capacity, and already their economies have been hit by containment strategies that have affected value chains, supply chains, exports, countries that are dependent on tourists. Think of the Maldives, think of parts of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. They're seeing their economies hard hit already, even as the spread of the virus threatens well-being among the population. We've been trying to track this from multiple perspectives. We published earlier this month our Asia Development Outlook, which we put out every year, that provides a forecast for the economy. And we see Asia's normally healthy growth rates plunge to a projected 2.4% for 2020. This is the developing countries of Asia, excluding those newly industrialized economies like Singapore and South Korea and Hong Kong. So developing Asia, sharp drop from between 5 and 6% down to 2.4%. And frankly, I don't think we've hit bottom yet. These forecasts are constantly being revised in the wake of new information and developments. And I would not be surprised if we see the forecast for the year decline further. Domestic risks are severe. Authorities are responding in these countries with measures to contain the spread, to treat the sick, and to stimulate the economy, to try to sustain business and deal with those hardest hit communities. Social protection programs have been expanded, but the possibility of a financial crisis cannot be excluded. So this is a story that continues to be told. And even if one would be viewing this 1 year from now in April 2021, we'll still be talking about COVID-19 rather in 2021, knowing that the development of a vaccine and its distribution, not just in wealthy countries, but in developing countries is some time off. So countries will be dealing with this challenge for some time. So this is the environment in which ADB working in Asia Pacific is operating. And with the strong support of shareholders like Canada, we're developing a very robust response to deal with the worst impacts and those that may be coming to countries in the region.
Just before we talk about the road to recovery, what has the bank been doing how has it been responding to the brunt of the crisis itself?
Well, we very early on in March, as the contours of this global pandemic started to become a little bit clearer, we announced a package of $6.5 billion to respond to the immediate needs of countries. And not long afterward, in the middle of April, we expanded that package when we explored how much we could actually tap of our own resources and reprogramming of existing resources. And now what we're talking about is a $20 billion response to COVID-19. So to break that out a little bit, about 13 of that $20 billion would be for counter-cyclical support. So the budgets of these countries have been very hard hit, and so just to help them sustain government expenditures, including caring for the hardest hit populations and businesses that in many cases are shuttered. About $2.5 billion of that 20 will be in the form of grants and concessional, that is lower interest loans. And about $2 billion of the 20 will be focused on private sector investments. So for example, teaming up with private healthcare providers and others to deal with one or another aspect of the crisis. To talk a little bit about what specifically these funds are for, in addition to the counter-cyclical funds that are going to the government budgets, we're looking at medical supplies, including for containment and testing, urgent response to health-related needs, also looking at disease detection and response, strengthening the overall government capacity to deal with health emergencies, this one and future ones, resources going to small to medium-sized enterprises and other firms, giving them access to capital that they've lost, supporting trade and supply chains, and helping governments with the measures that they're taking to help the most negatively affected populations. One of the tragedies of this whole crisis is that the world, including the Asia Pacific region, was in general making good strides. If you look back over the last 10, 20 years toward the millennium and then sustainable development goals, extreme poverty as a share of the total population has been sharply reduced in the last 2 decades. And this pandemic, unfortunately, is halting gains and reversing them depending on which country and sub-region we're talking about. So it is a crisis with major implications for broader social indicators.
Being that we're in the midst of it, I'm sure we've all been sort of caught up in the daily drama of it. But let's think forward a little bit to the extent possible. What has the bank, what kind of conversations has the bank had with your peer IFIs, and from your own analysis, what are you learning about what's possible in terms of recovery?
Well, there are some optimistic scenarios where the region, the developing countries in Asia and Pacific, may largely bounce back in 2021, but this is contingent on so many things. And today's forecasts may have to be substantially revised. As far as what countries need to do, a lot of them are doing just that. That is to say, spending what's necessary that they can manage within their debt structure and such, to meet the emergency needs, to whether they be health related or the fact that people are jobless. In the recovery which comes, and it will come, you can imagine that countries will be looking longer term that they don't want to go through this again. So we can't prevent a new virus coming out that requires a new vaccine, but we can have healthcare facilities that are better coordinated and have greater capacity and information systems to share within countries at the subnational units, subnational level, and between countries. There are a number of things that can be put into place. I would hearken back to the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, and then in the end of the last decade where we had the global economic and financial crisis. A number of measures were taken within countries and among countries to enhance the resilience and preparation for the next crisis. And I can completely imagine that once we move the focus a little bit away from urgent treatment, care, prevention, containment, and such, to how do we build back better, if you will, I can imagine that there'll be opportunities for companies and individual firms, individual consultants in Canada to help governments as they go through planning, strategizing, and constructing better systems, public administration systems, information systems, the actual medical facilities, to be better prepared for the inevitable next pandemic, which hopefully will not be as destructive as this one.
Mm-hmm. So specifically then, as we start to overcome the worst of this, at least in many of the countries, the worst of the crisis that's upon us now, and to think ahead, how do you feel Canadian professionals should be positioning themselves to offer services that do help recovery, that do help build some of that capacity you were talking about?
Well, I think what you're going to see, not only from the Asian Development Bank, but from our sister institutions, the other development banks that Canada is also a shareholder of, we are beginning to post the details of project concepts responding to this crisis. So COVID-19 support to a range of countries. And there are already on the websites of the different development banks, dozens of project concepts moving their way toward board approval. And some of these have already been approved by the boards of the relevant development bank. And so now we're moving to the stage of planning the procurement and consulting required to implement these projects. So what I would encourage Canadian international development practitioners to start following these closely, because it's fast moving, okay? It's still early days in some sense, because the vast majority of the resources and of the projects that the different MDBs, the development banks will be supporting, are yet to come. Already announcements are being made, and the ball is rolling, and we're moving toward procurement and consulting opportunities. Now, in some cases, if it's, again, counter-cyclical support, it's just basically helping the governments with their budgets. But there will be specific projects where expertise, including of Canadian firms and individual consultants, will be required. So don't lose out to the competition from other countries by getting to this later. Now is when the projects are beginning to emerge. And keep an eye on new announcements by the development banks, and they've been putting out quite a number of them that are indicating what's the next direction, and what are the subsets of support that will be extended. These provide a clue as to actual opportunities in the next few weeks and months that will emerge and present themselves as consulting offers and RFPs.
Great. And obviously the first place to go to find out more is the ADB website, hey?
Yes, and to keep it simple for the viewership, if you go to our homepage, www.adb.org, and you go to the bottom of the page, there is subscriber services, and there a consulting firm can sign up to receive notices of new consulting and procurement opportunities. So without having to continually refresh and revisit the website, you can have put into your inbox the latest news about consulting opportunities or developments on COVID-19 projects or actions in a particular country. So that's the first bit, first recommendation. Secondly, I would say within our website to search for the Business Center, spelled the American way, if you will, center. But that is the entry point, if you will, to all of the resources that a consulting firm or an individual consultant needs to access opportunities at ADB. So those are two specific concrete suggestions. Beyond that, a lot of the standard advice applies. Make your expertise known. So you can do that in a variety of ways, including informing the trade commissioners that the Canadian government have in place at the development banks to let them know the services that and expertise that you have that could be relevant to fighting in some way COVID-19. And it's not all in the health sector, even if that's where the preponderance is at the moment. And I would also say, if there's a particular service or innovation, if an individual, an entrepreneur or a lab is working on something that they expect to be able to offer to the market in the near future, let me know about it, because my colleagues are trying to track new products that could be of use in developing countries that we're working with. And so I have received already a few indications of, for example, testing devices that are not something that we can purchase today that don't relate to a specific consulting offer, but being aware of this will help us advise our governments about what is on the market and where there is expertise. And it would be good if some of the expertise we could point to relevant to addressing COVID-19 is in Canada.
Bart, many thanks for this update and for a kind of a up-to-the-minute analysis from the ADB's perspective of COVID-19 impacts and recovery prospects. For those of you who are wanting to sort of get a little bit more basic background on ADB, Bart, you gave us a pretty good presentation back a year ago, and most of that is entirely relevant today, eh?
Absolutely. And one thing I will share with you, Phil, to distribute to the membership is a tip sheet, a cheat sheet, if you will, that's not related specifically to COVID-19, but how you can enhance your chances of winning a contract at ADB. So I'll share that bit of information for your membership.
Look for that on the CAIDP page where this video resides, and we'll you can download that. Thank you very much, Bart, and we'll certainly keep the contacts open between CAIDP and ADB, and hopefully with the other IFIs as well, as we move from this crisis into a recovery period.
Thank you very much, Phil, and ADB would very much like to be working more with Canadian consultants who can meet the demands of our developing member countries in the projects that we're financing. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too.